Just a little background about me. I am a naturopathic doctor. I just moved back from California. I had my own little practice, but life and things brought me back here, and I'm happy to be here. So, like I said, I just moved. On my way home, I drove. So I took my little Subaru and I went across country. And something really interesting happened on my road trip that I wasn't expecting. And that was I stayed with a colleague of mine who is the medical director at an inpatient fasting facility. And so people come and they stay an average of 3 weeks, and the only intervention that they receive is water fasting and a vegan diet. And so I was supposed to stay for one night. I was just going to spend the one night with her. And I got to round with her and I said, this is so amazing. Can I get more involved? And so I ended up staying for 3 weeks, and I did an internship there, and it was my job to go around to all different patients' rooms and round on them and make sure they're doing okay and all that kind of thing. Conveniently, they just had an opening right whenever I was there, so that's what happened. And it was amazing, but I left feeling a little ruined, because I was like, how can I possibly try to practice medicine without implementing this modality? Because it has done more amazing things in 3 weeks than what I've seen in my years so far. So that is where this really stemmed from, because I was like, I need to tell as many people as I can about this modality because it's amazing. Fasting, it's really funny because I think that it sounds a little alarming to people, especially if you're like, we're not going to feed you for 3 days. Well, it sounds a little alarming, but it's actually one of the most natural things that our body does. So our body really only has 2 mechanisms. It has a feeding mechanism and a fasting mechanism. And it used to be that we would naturally go into a fasting state regularly. You know, we didn't have food available to us all the time. And so, you know, to have somebody stand up and talk to you about fasting would be almost as ridiculous as someone standing up and talking to you about sleeping, because it was just so a part of everyday life for most of humans, you know. So we've just completely gone away from that because food is so readily available now. And so people kind of take it for granted, but it is quite arguably the most powerful thing we can do to really assist our health. People fast for a lot of different reasons. So yes, there's a health aspect, but and I'll quickly mention this, there's a psycho-spiritual component to it. Every religion in the world has a fasting practice, and it's built into their religion. You know, Jesus fasted for 40 days. I love this verse, actually. This is a story in the Bible about there's a kid who was having seizures, or demons and entities had spiritual malady, and you know, Jesus couldn't, or the disciples couldn't cast out the demon, and Jesus came and did, and they asked him, why could we not do it? And he said, the only thing that will help this child is fasting and prayer. And you see that throughout not just the Bible, but out through many traditional texts. Fasting is the primary mechanism of healing that they go to for any sort of sickness that there is. So, I have to mention that. I think it's interesting that Moses, Elijah, and Jesus all fasted for 40 days and 40 nights. That 40 mark is kind of an interesting mark. Why fast? So, I won't go through all of these, but these are conditions that have good research supporting the efficacy of fasting, and I'll go through some later on too. So there's different types of fasting, and so to say fasting is kind of a misnomer, because you know, fasting for 40 days is very, very different and a different mechanism than fasting for 1 day. So the most common ones and ones that are most researched are intermittent fasting, and so that's whenever you fast anywhere from 12 to 24 hours, and often done like every other day. That's how a lot of people do it. And so a lot of research is done that way. And I'll go into a little more research as to what that's really helpful for. And then this long-term fasting, 30 to 40 days. where you take literally nothing but water. That should really be done medically supervised. That should not be done by yourself, because definitely symptoms can pop up. My mom's on her second day of fasting. You can interrogate her about that later on. But symptoms arise. It's not a seamless process. That's why people don't do it very often. And so it's really better to be under the care of somebody who knows what to look for and know what they're doing. Fasting mimicking. This is actually a super exciting form of fasting that is just coming out. And I'll talk a little bit more about it later, but basically it's where you trick the body into thinking it's fasting, but you just stick to under 500 calories, but it's basically all fat. So your body stays in a ketogenic mode, but it's still such a low calorie load that your digestive system's not really doing too much work. This is what's really used in chemo and a lot of, out west, there's a lot of people using this for a lot of different things. So for diabetes, for hypertension, for people who can't go and do 40 days of fasting, you can still do the fasting mimicking while working and doing other things. So it's something that's actually kind of plausible for somebody while they're going throughout their everyday life. But the research with it with chemo, and I'll talk a little bit more about it, is very exciting. So the fasting state. So what's actually happening whenever you're in a fasting state? You don't really think about it, but 80% of your body's energy goes to digestion, because there's a lot going on over there. You have your enzymes, you have your bile, it's moving constantly through peristalsis. It takes up a lot of energy, and it never goes to sleep. And it's something we don't really think about. Our brains need to sleep, our muscles need to sleep, but our digestive system also needs to sleep, and often it doesn't get that rest that it needs. And whenever it doesn't get the rest that it needs, you're a lot more prone to irritable bowel or Crohn's or IBS or whatever it might be, because it doesn't have the time to repair itself that it is absolutely necessary to do. So the fasting state, that's what's kind of happening. What I think is really interesting is that the body is really intelligent, and it will go through and it will try to find what parts of your body are not necessary. So if you have cysts or small tumor growths or just tissue that's not really functioning all that well, it does this really intelligent autophagy, and so it will kind of make those cells die, and then it will eat it up, because it would rather eat that as a protein source than your muscles, because there's an intelligence that knows not to go for the muscles. So first, it goes for all of the tissue that is not healthy. And so whenever we say, fasting is a healing mechanism, that's really why, because the body is smart and it will go where it intelligently should go. I could get into, I'll touch on this too, just this idea of the smartest physician is in our body, and we don't actually have to do that much half the time. If we just give it a break and let the body do its thing, often it will fix itself. Often in the attempt to fix something, we actually create more problems, whether it be conventional or even alternative therapies. Fasting, okay, so it's actually funny, because a lot of research is saying, what happens in this condition in a starving state? And that's a really alarming word, because no one wants to starve. But there's actually a huge difference between fasting and starving. Fasting is whenever you are utilizing your body's fat stores, which, it's good to get rid of those, for fuel. Versus starving is whenever you're actually eating and metabolizing your organs, and that creates irreparable damage that you often can lead to death or severe problems. And so there's a huge difference. So most people have 3 to 4 months worth of fat reserves if you're an average lean person. Men often have up to 70 days worth of fat reserves. And actually what's interesting, I think this is on a later slide, I think I put it in, I can't remember exactly, but while you're fasting, all your organs get smaller except for your brain and in men, they're testicles. And that's because in in a state, if you were to imagine an animal where they're trying to find food, and they need adrenaline, they need testosterone, they need like that oomph. So you also see an increase in norepinephrine and some of these other hormones like cortisol to try to give you that oomph to go and try to find food. So I found that interesting. I already said that. 3 to 4 months worth of fat reserves. Oh, this is really interesting. You kind of think of it as, I think our initial instinct is, well, wouldn't you get really depleted in all your nutrients if you're not eating? But they actually did a study where on a bunch of different people, and one person even went up to 8 months of fasting, and no one was mineral or vitamin deficient by the end. There is some mechanism that's really intelligent that recycles all of those vitamins. The exception to that is if you already go in a malnutrition state or anemic or whatever it might be. You can't create things out of thin air, unfortunately. It's remarkably safe. Like I said, this is a mechanism that is so ingrained within our system that it's like sleeping. So it's very safe. People who long-term fasting is not safe for, people with kidney disease, people with type 1 diabetes. It is pretty harsh. It can be harsh on the kidneys, and so if you already have that compromised state, that's something to think about. Fasting versus low calorie. So I think a lot of people think that it's kind of equivalent, and it's actually completely different. Whenever you are in a low calorie kind of dieting state, your body is still using glucose, usually, to produce energy. And because it takes about 2 days to switch to a ketogenic state. And so whenever you are in a low calorie state chronically, what actually happens is that your body will then steal protein from your muscles and protein from other sources and then convert it to sugar. Versus whenever you're in a fasting state, it does that very, very minimally. And so it just takes it from your fat. So in a fasting state, you retain most of your lean muscle, versus in a low calorie state, you're actually eating your muscle a lot more so. And it's a lot harsher on your kidneys to be in a low calorie state than a fasting state, because protein breakdown is a lot harder on your kidneys than fat breakdown. So, you know, there's a lot to be said about that. Oh, and it causes slowing down the metabolic rate. So whenever you're fasting, your metabolic rate does slow down. It slows down about 1% each day. And then once it hits the 75 marker, it kind of plateaus. So that's good. Versus in a low calorie state, it will continue to plateau, and eventually your metabolic state will be very, very low. And so whenever you do start eating again, it comes back with vengeance. So that's like the classic dieting issue, hunger. Okay, so I don't know about you, but I could probably eat all day long if I didn't have the self-control to stop myself. You know, there's sometimes the mechanism that tells your body when you're hungry, when you're not, gets a little bit warped in a lot of people, and especially if you start stress eating. And so it's really interesting whenever you fast, you break that, you break that, how should I say it? You break that neural pattern. So whenever you are, first of all, and I might go into this a little bit more later on, but whenever you're in a fasting state, your brain becomes a lot more neuroplastic, because something called brain-derived neurotrophic factor goes up. And whenever it goes up, it's a lot easier to break old patterns and set down new ones. And so whenever if you're trying to break this, you know, whatever it might be, maybe you're stressed and then stress eating habit or whatever it is, you can break that very easily. And then your control over your hunger no longer controls you, because if you think about like a Pavlovian dog, or what's that study with the dogs where they have saliva, Pavlovian, yeah. It's the same sort of thing. You reward your body every time you eat in response to hunger, and so it expects to get fed whenever it's hungry. Versus if it kind of learns that the hunger is not really going to do anything, it stops roaring so dramatically. So here are just 10 mechanisms of fasting. And I won't go into each of these in detail, but one thing is that you lose about 1 pound per day that you fast. If you're doing a long-term fast, you usually gain about 4 to 5 pounds back once you start eating. So it's not necessarily the best thing for weight loss unless you do a really long-term fast. For that, intermittent fasting is is usually more attainable for weight loss than long-term fasting. Naturopathic. So that means your body's getting rid of all the salt. So we have salt in just about every single thing that we put in our mouths. Like, we salt everything. That's just how Americans are. That's how most people in the world are. And salt's not necessarily bad, but over intake of it can be. And what happens is that the salt goes into your interstitial tissue and draws fluid into those states. And so whenever you're in a fasting state, it finally cleans out all that extra salt. And so as a result, blood pressure goes down. Cells are able to communicate more effectively to each other because there's not as much fluid blocking them from really talking to each other. Detoxification. Gosh, I mean, that's kind of like one of the main things it does, though it's so hard to find research explaining in detail exactly how. So what I can say about that, though, is that whenever you're taking fat out of, so when it comes to toxins, whatever they may be, whether from the environment or just your body making things that it shouldn't be there, water soluble aren't really too worrisome because you urinate them out usually. The ones that are the bad guys are the fat-soluble ones, the ones that get stuck in your fat and then they stay there until you're old. And then they really don't show up until you start having neurological problems because all of your nervous system is basically fat. I mean, that's the main macro protein or molecule in your nervous system is fat. And so whenever you store toxins in your fat, it makes them a lot more prone to disease and cancers and whatever it might be. So anyway, whenever you start pulling out fat, your body is also really smart, and it will pull out the fat that has the toxins stored in it, because yes, it is that smart. The problem is that then whenever you break up the triglyceride, you get a dumping of all these toxins into your system. And so a lot of the symptoms that you get from fasting are really detox symptoms. And so people get rashes, and they get really bad breath, and all these things start happening, and it can look kind of ugly sometimes. People break out in terrible acne, all these things. But actually, it's like this healing crisis that your body is doing. Enzymatic systems are used to mobilize fat. So what that basically means is that the mechanism to burn fat versus glucose gets upregulated. It's really simple. And so once that gets upregulated, then whenever you even come off the fast, that's still upregulated, and it's much easier for you to burn fat. Because whenever glucose remains your primary fuel source, it never has to switch over to the ketogenic mode because it is a lot more energy intensive. And so your body is smart and won't do that. And so it's a lot easier to switch into, I think it's called ketogenic priming, I think is what it's called, into that mode after you fast. Insulin resistance, oh my gosh. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later on. But insulin resistance can virtually go away. And that sounds really shocking because how many conditions are caused by insulin resistance? I mean, most problems in America are caused by insulin resistance. But what happens is, and there are some different schools of thought, so if what you know might contradict what I'm saying, that's okay. But there's different schools of thought, and what I was kind of indoctrinated with whenever I was at this fasting clinic, they're strict vegans, and they're no salt, no oil vegan diet, and let's just say they're religious about this mentality, and they really taught us that, you know, it's actually whenever there's too much fat stored in a cell for whatever reason, it loses its ability to, it's the fat stored in the cell that causes the insulin resistance. And maybe one day I can draw that out for anybody, but it's kind of hard to explain. So whenever you draw that fat out of those cells, then those insulin receptors become a lot more responsive to the insulin. So that's the basic thought process behind it. Shifts the microbiome. Okay, this is actually my favorite part, and I didn't go into it too much, so I'll just mention it here. You know, every single day we're feeding our microbiome with the food that we eat. And so it's constantly growing and growing and growing. And so there's this fight between the microbiome and our immune system to try to keep the bad microbes down and the good ones up. You know, this whole process that gets totally out of whack for most Americans. This is really beautiful because whenever you fast, it's almost like the microbiome goes into hibernation a little bit and it kind of retracts. And what that does is that allows the immune system to have an upper hand, potentially for the first time ever, in really shifting the microbiome. And so it will go through and it will take out all the bad guys much easier and faster and with less trouble than otherwise whenever you're feeding the microbiome. Because whenever you're feeding the microbiome, it's non-selective, and so everybody's getting fed. Your immune system is selective, so that's good. The other thing, if you're doing a long-term fast, it's really important how you refeed. And I didn't go into that too much here, but at the fasting clinic that I went to, you know, everybody would refeed with melons first, you know, juicy things, but that were low glycemic, so not like mango, but like cantaloupe and that kind of stuff. And but high fibrous water content, basically. And then you would switch to vegetables. And no processed food, no processed grains, and you know, absolutely no sugar of any form. You know, fake sugar, I should say. And so whenever you do a very special re-inoculation, basically, of the microbiome, the good guys get fed first because they've actually shown in research that your diet makes a far bigger difference in your microbiome than probiotics do. So you can get probiotics all day long, but it's basically like dropping a drop in a bucket, versus really matters feeding the good fibers, insoluble fibers, so you feed the good ones. What else? So you know those people who are constantly stressed all the time? You can see it in their muscles, and you can see it in how they hold themselves, and they're a lot more prone to anxiety attacks and all that kind of stuff. Well, that's usually because they're stuck in a sympathetic mode for whatever reason. And don't ask me how, but whenever you fast, something happens and there's a switch, and you go into a parasympathetic state, which is actually ironic to think about because you would think it would be the other way around. Whenever you're in a fasting state, you would think sympathetic, you're trying to find food. But the parasympathetic state comes on board a little bit stronger, and it remains. So it's kind of this reset to the nervous system. And so some people argue that that's the most beneficial aspect of a fast, because that is a really hard thing to fix. And whenever you fix that little switch, so many other things fall in line. You know, it's a lot easier to have a good microbiome. It's easier to have, you know, good hormone ratios and that kind of stuff. The psychospiritual impact. Miranda's going to do a meditation with us afterwards, so I'm excited about that. One of the really cool things is that, you know, if you think about meditation as a way to attempt to connect to your body, we have all this foreign stuff. When I say foreign stuff, you know, our digestive tract is actually an exterior aspect of our body, you know, and so anything we put in it is kind of staying in the exterior, even though it's in our interior, if that makes any sense. It's not really part of us. It's just kind of going through us. So when you get rid of all of the stuff that's just kind of going through us, you're just left with your body for the first time. And your microbiome dies down, and there's, a lot of people who say that we're kind of, our mental state might be more microbiome or parasite based than we give it credit for. And so when you kind of die down the microbiome and get rid of, all the stuff that's actually not part of you, you're left with yourself. And it's a lot easier to connect with yourself when you're not influenced by all these other factors. So that's one aspect, and you could talk for days about the psychospiritual aspect of it. Not to mention, I'll mention this one thing, but this concept of, we don't live on bread alone. And so we need to eat spirituality. We need to eat a connection to the divine. And it almost forces you to draw energy from that source rather than, metabolic sources more so. Obesity. Oh, this is basically saying that whenever we're eating, you're either in an insulin state or a glucagon state. So insulin pushes glucose into your cells to have fat storage, okay? That's what it does. Insulin and glucagon are like a seesaw. You can't really have them both there at the same time. So glucagon is really necessary to have any sort of fat burning. So while you have excess glucose in your system and you're feeding, you can't really lose weight because you're constantly putting food into your cells. You need glucagon to store weight. So that's basic, but it's important. There's some conflicting things out there about whether or not you should exercise while you're in a fasting state or not. I don't think you should because, and this is what was explained to me, it's not just my opinion. Whenever, it takes a lot of work you have to keep about 80 milligrams of sugar in your bloodstream to feed your red blood cells and your brain, or else you die. So you can't just have fat. You also need to have that little bit of sugar to cushion you. And so where do you get that sugar from? Well, you get that a little bit from the backbone of the triglyceride, but mainly you get that from the breakdown of unnecessary tissue or protein. And so whenever you keep using up that little cushion for muscles and that kind of thing, what happens is you'll actually eat more of your muscle and you'll eat more of the good tissue that you don't want to. And so you'll lose lean muscle mass a lot quicker if you exercise while in a fasting state. So there's 3 different types of diabetes. Type 1, you die if you try to fast. But type 1 responds very, very well to the ketogenic diet. It keeps numbers normalized in a really profound way. And it's interesting because at the center that I went to, they said that whenever they've had type 1 diabetics come in and just do the vegan diet, their numbers normalize better than any other time in their life, really. Type 2, reverse insulin resistance. I mentioned that already and how that works. Okay, so, once diabetes progresses to a certain level, you have to use insulin. I think we were all kind of aware of that. That happens because the beta cells, whether they get exhausted basically, and they kind of die, the cells that make insulin. They've actually done studies saying and showing and demonstrating in rats, not humans, that whenever you fast a mouse, they'll actually have regeneration of those pancreatic cells that create insulin. And so I actually had a case study up here, but I took it down. But there was a guy who was there at the fasting center. He was a pilot. He was, super tall, very fit, worked out every single day. And then whenever he was going for his normal routine checkup, he had, high blood sugar. So he did a year of medication, nothing shifted, and it turns out that he had something called type 1.5 diabetes, which is whenever they have diabetes, but then they have like late onset type 1, basically. And so it's an autoimmune process where they start attacking their beta cells and they stop losing the ability to create insulin, but it's later on in life usually. So we were really not sure if we could fast him or not, because he kind of fell into this gray area. And so what we did was we first put him on juice fast. So we saw how he did with that. His sugar levels dropped even with the juice fast, and we were like, okay, that's good. And then we're like, they're dropped enough and they seem to be steady. Let's try you on water fast, but only for like a day, see how you do. He ended up fasting for 10 days, and by the end, his numbers had completely normalized. And I wish I left before he did. I would love to know whenever he refuted what happened, but I can't really say. But the fact that his body was able to, and he had great energy, he was very happy, maintain his blood sugar and that kind of stuff in a fasting state, indicated that there was some level of regeneration of his pancreatic cells. So that's kind of cool. Cancer, okay. It's like shocking to me actually being back here how many stories I've heard of people having cancer. Yes, people have cancer in California, but there really is more cancer over here. I really think there is. And I don't know why that is. I'm not sure. But it's something that is on everybody's radar because everybody's affected by it. So fasting is very protective for cancer. Will it prevent you? We can't say that, obviously. But so cancer cells, they're kind of baby cells. They're mutated cells, and then they mutate more, and then they mutate more. And often in that process of mutation, they lose the ability to switch from using, to using ketones versus, and I haven't got into that, but I will, ketones versus sugar as fuel. And so if you put a lot of, I was listening in on a phone call at Ella's actually, and there was a cancer specialist, and he said that I think 87% of cancers respond to PET scans, which indicates that they use sugar as a primary fuel. So that's 87% of cancers use sugar as a fuel, not ketones. And a large portion of those don't have the ability to use ketones. And so even if you put people on a ketogenic diet, you will often see they kind of don't get any worse. Even if they don't get better, they often don't get worse. So whenever I was there was actually a doctor, she was a MD physician, who had a very unusual type of lymphoma. And this type of lymphoma, the only treatment for it was a year of chemo and radiation, and if you survived that, then they would give you a bone marrow transplant after a year, and no one made it past 2 years, basically. Well, she knew the statistics because she's a physician, and she said, I'm not doing that. And so she started fasting. So when I was there, she had been there for 30 days fasting. And she's on her 4th year now. So she's lived 3 years longer than even the best prognosis, really. And it just hasn't shifted. It hasn't gone away, but it hasn't gotten worse. It's kind of just like stuck in this state, which is still better than nothing. She's still working. She's completely, has no symptoms at all of her cancer. You know, that's just one example, and obviously we can't come out and say that, but it's there. But another thing that's really happening that's really interesting is over in California at UCSD, there's this guy named Walter Longo, and he has been studying fasting for a long time. And so there's a very unique chemical protective mechanism of fasting. So they've done studies where when people get exposed to high levels of, I don't know, name any toxic, like lead. Actually, I can't remember what the study was, but it was toxic. And they fasted the people, and the people who fasted did fine and actually had no symptoms of toxicity versus the ones who didn't. So there's like this protective mechanism that no one really can figure out how it works. They've started fasting chemo patients, which obviously we know is a poison to the system, and it affects other cells than just the the cancer cells. And not only did they see a dramatic decrease in any symptomology from the chemo itself, but they actually saw that they responded to the chemo much better. It made them more responsive and the treatment more efficacious than what it is. So this, I think, is going to be, in the future, a part of every cancer patient's treatment. We're not there yet. This is all very, very new research. So water fasting is anything over 5 days, so it should be medically supervised. But what you see this increase in cortisol, which we think of as a bad thing. But in this state, I actually don't think it is a bad thing. And there's a lot of different philosophies around that, but I won't get into that too much. Growth hormone, that's really important, because as far as repairing the body, whenever something needs to be broken down and then repaired, it has that ability, because the growth hormone actually goes up, which is pretty amazing. Glucagon, so that means more fat burning, norepinephrine, and melatonin. And I already mentioned the brain-derived neurotrophic factor. So it's really protective for dementia and Alzheimer's and neurodegeneration. And it's one of the most important things you can do to keep your brain sharp, as we all want to do. Stages of fasting. So really quickly, and I just have 3 slides on what's actually happening in the body while you're in a fasting state. Okay, so the first phase, the first 6 hours, is just getting rid of all the food that you've already have in there from things you just ate. 24 to 46 hours, you're first using all the glycogen from your liver. Yes, we have glycogen in our muscles, but it's really hard to get that glycogen into our liver, and we can't convert it to glucose in our muscles. And so it gets converted into a few other things, but that's not the primary source. Really, it's just the liver glycogen that gets used. Gluconeogenesis, and so our liver primarily, initially, converts proteins and components of fat into glucose. What I found really interesting, and I think it's on a different slide, is that towards the end, the kidneys are the major forces in gluconeogenesis, which I didn't even know the kidneys did that. Truthfully, I didn't. I never learned that. And then ketosis. And then so in ketosis, it's whenever the fat gets broken down into triglycerides. The triglycerides then go to the liver. They get broken down to ketones. There's 3 different main ones. There's more than that, but these are the primary ones. And then your brain is able to use ketones. Your muscles are, and actually everything besides red blood cells are able to use ketones as their primary fuel source. Ketogenesis, the downside of this is that it's harsh on your kidneys a little bit, and it does put you in an acidic state. And so what you'll see is people's respiratory rate goes up and their heart rate goes up. Gluconeogenesis, I already talked about that a little bit. Hypertension. So he did Goldhammer, which is the main guy from the fasting center that I was at. He did a study with 174 people, and he was able to get 100% of them off their blood pressure meds and get their blood pressures to normalize with just fasting and a vegan, oil-free, salt-free diet. And then after 2-year follow-up, most of them had maintained those benefits that they had gained. And so he actually did a really interesting, he paired with the union, this engineering union, and they had their own private insurance system, basically. And so anyone who had hypertension or diabetes or metabolic syndrome, they went and they fasted for 3 weeks, and he was able to show that he saved about $3 grand a year in their healthcare bills. For every single patient. So actually the engineering firm benefited dramatically from just sending these guys there. And it was funny because initially he was like, I'm not going to send them to a 3-week-long vacation. He was like, do you think that like starving yourself and having all these symptoms happening is a vacation? And the guy was like, okay, I guess not. I guess I'll send them here. So inflammation. So you see a decrease in C-reactive protein, ceterate, all these different markers that are indications of inflammation. Most importantly, So rheumatoid arthritis is just like, it is textbook. If you have rheumatoid arthritis and you fast, you will have symptom relief. Hands down, that's what happens. The food reintroduction process, sometimes people can get return of symptoms, but they've shown that if you stay on a vegan, oil-free, salt-free diet, that they don't have a return of symptoms. And that's, because rheumatoid arthritis is largely due to food allergies, and so that's really why often. I will say that a lot of the research that I've read is written by the guy who has this inpatient facility, because he's the only one who was brave enough to have this facility in the United States. And so it's a little biased, and we need to have more centers that will do more research, because he feels very, very strongly about the salt-free, oil-free, vegan. Other findings, they've showed that fatty liver, the complete reversal, happens in most patients who go through fasting, which is huge. Fasting is the only known mechanism to slow down the aging process. And so people who fast regularly look younger. They really do, and they live longer. Fasting, I said that's right, decreases the size of every organ. So really quickly, the neuroplasticity piece is really interesting. There's a wonderful documentary on Amazon Prime called The Science of Fasting. Yes, I stole the name from that. It was a good name, but you should watch it. And then there's another one called Fasting, and they talk about fasting, through the ages. And there was this really amazing psychiatrist who had a patient that just refused to eat, and so he was like, well, okay, don't eat. Let's see what happens, kind of deal. He was kind of experimenting on the patient. It's back in the 20s, you could do that. And so the patient didn't eat for 8 days, and then after 8 days, the patient, because he had like catatonic schizophrenia, he started talking again. He started engaging with his peers, and then he walked off with no symptoms and was able to re-enter the workforce and do all these things. And so made the guy think, whoa, maybe there's something to this from a mental health standpoint. And so then he proceeded to fast all of his patients who were willing to, basically, and 80% of them were able to reintegrate into society just fine. So that is huge, especially with all the mental health challenges that our country is facing. So something to that, and I think that has to be implemented somewhere. I don't know how to do it, but it has to be. Very basically, who should not fast? People who are on medications should not fast, which is everybody. And so what you have to do is you have to work with a practitioner long enough to get your numbers good enough, and then you can fast. That's kind of the process to go through it. So at the place we went to, there was this guy. He was a banker, and had a very, very stressful job. And he was about 350 pounds, and big guy. And his cholesterol's through the roof, sugar through the roof. I think his blood pressure was about 180 over 100, like whenever I would take it, standard. And so he wasn't allowed to fast because he was on all these medications. So he just did the vegan diet for a while, for a week. And within a week, I saw his blood pressure normalize on the vegan diet alone. And I had been paleo, I had been keto, I had been all these different things. And I went, oh my gosh, okay. I really need to give more credit to the vegan diet right now. And I just kind of shook my head, because it was amazing to see that and to see his blood pressure normalize. He was able to get off insulin. And so we were able to fast him after a week of just doing the vegan diet. So it's very possible to shift someone very quickly, especially when they're in an inpatient facility where all their stress factors are taken away. Because like I said, he was the president of a very, high-end bank, and he had a lot of stress. Pregnant, type 1 diabetes, kidney disease, severe nutrition. Really quickly, I'm just going to tell you about some of the things I saw when I was there. There was a woman who came in legally blind because she had something called Druck's dystrophy, and she was there for a year. She basically just did the vegan diet. She wasn't very compliant, so she didn't want to fast, and so she just did the vegan diet. And after a year of being there, she had 20/20 vision, and she came in legally blind. I was only there for 3 weeks, and people who I saw come in and then leave reported to me that their glasses that they had used for 20 years, they didn't need anymore because their eyesight had somehow improved. And I was like, what? I didn't know that could happen. And that happened not once but twice while I was there. What other amazing things happened? Everybody's blood pressure normalized, everybody's sugar normalized. Oh, I should mention this. Yes, so the first 2 days of fasting are kind of crappy. Most people don't really feel very good. But after you get, my mother's in that stage, she's in a crappy mood. She was like, are you supposed to be sore all over? I'm like, yeah, it's kind of part of it. I didn't tell you that on purpose. But then after you actually do switch into the ketogenic mode, you get this like euphoric state. And so half the people who were walking around look like they were walking on clouds. And your eyes get like really, really sharp, and you see colors brighter than you could have ever seen them. And you just feel like singing, I swear to you. And they actually have more energy than most people do while eating. And I can't tell you how many people said, wow, it feels like such a burden to start eating again, because they actually loved not eating for a couple days. Not a couple days, usually these people, it was like the 5 to 7 day mark. That was whenever people started feeling good. And also, I will offset that with, you know, there's this really interesting concept called no, I can't think of what it's called. Hahnemann's law, I want to say. And it's this concept that we're an onion. And as you peel back layers of the onion, old symptoms return. And so that was frequently seen. And so people would get a rash on their leg, and you would ask, have you had that rash before? And they said, yes, I had it whenever I was 21. And you would, you know, they would get really bad sinus problems. Have you had that before? Yes. You know, all these different things would come back, and they'd be of lesser intensity, but they would just flare for a little bit and then go away. And it's like this really beautiful purging mechanism that your body has, and it has to be done in a reverse order. And so it was always done in a reverse order because it was an indicator that you've gotten through that one layer of the onion, and so that you can come closer to yourself. And so the body is amazing. Whenever we allow it to heal, it can heal better than we could ever imagine. And that's, I guess, what I want everyone to take from this talk. So yeah, that's it. Fasting, go fast. Oh yeah, questions? Sure.